updates. Good morning, Tobago.
Good morning, and welcome to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates, guys. You know, when you see me here, I'm always here to have those conversations that you want to have to get your morning started and ask those questions that you want asked. And this morning is like no other. And this morning we're going to start off having some extremely interesting conversations with everything that has been happening locally, nationally. And one of those things are some of the comments that were made recently by the Prime Minister, as well as the appointment of a new chairman for SPEL, the board at Studley Park. So guys, this morning we're going to have that conversation with Dr. Vanus James, who is a senior economist here in Tobago and political analyst. Good morning, Dr. Vanus James.
How are you doing?
I am fine. Now, it's always a pleasure to sit with you and have these discussions. As I said, this morning we're going to start off a bit with the commentary that took place over the weekend by the Prime Minister at that Toco PNM family day, I believe they had. And one of the comments that he made was that he is proposing to bring to the Parliament a bill that is going to abolish the Service Commission. Any thoughts you have on that as we get into the discussion this morning?
Well, two sets of thoughts. First of all, a political party meeting is perhaps not the best forum for the announcement of serious public policy. So I don't know if we should take the Prime Minister as a person who is on top of all his marbles. That's the first thing. But secondly, any change in the Constitution regarding the service commissions will require the support of the opposition. And so this is not a matter for you to just go and declare you're going to do in your party meeting. You have to bring the issue properly to the country. Let's understand exactly what the intent is. If it's in the Constitution, they are there for quality control, to ensure the quality of work, the quality of appointments, and the quality of work of public servants. And if he is not satisfied with that, then he needs to say, well, what is wrong and what needs to be adjusted in the way they work that requires a reconstitution of these commissions or an abolishment of their roles. And it's important to say, too, that it is not just public servants at the level of the PSAs and the commissioners and so on that need to be supervised. Let me say, the country has long known that we also need to supervise the work of the Prime Minister himself and the Cabinet. If the Prime Minister is really serious about moving the country forward, he needs to address that issue. And that requires fundamental constitutional reform. So if you're going to go to the opposition leader and work out an arrangement to get constitutional reform, maybe we should just tackle the whole problem we've been clamoring for since 1970, to set up oversight arrangements in the Parliament to allow us to oversee the work of the Cabinet.
And it's interesting that you talk about the constitutional reform, because he mentioned that a lot of persons have come to him about constitutional reform in that way. However, he has identified the true issue to be a management arrangement issue that has contributed to the lack of productivity of the public service. You know, he says that in his opinion, the public service is underperforming. And to remedy the situation, he's thinking about creating a new system of management as opposed to an entire constitutional reform. And with this, he's proposing a single tribunal that would be responsible for the public service as opposed to the Public Service Commission.
Well, this is what I'm saying. I don't think he's given this serious thought, or maybe sufficient thought. Productivity in the public service is a much more fundamental problem than lies at the level of, say, qualified, competent, well-trained officers. when you take the public service as a whole, in Trinidad as well as in Tobago, a large part of the productivity problem has to do with the large volume of persons who are employed with inadequate education, training, materials, capital to work with. So they are, by structure, low productivity workers. And the way you solve that problem is not by changing the management arrangements. You've got to change the structure of the national economy, which is a problem he hasn't been able to solve. This diversification of the national economy to create jobs outside of the public service so people could take up those jobs, train for them, move out of the public service, and change the productivity platform of both the public service by leaving only high-skilled, well-equipped, well-capitalized persons in there to do what they have to do on a faster pace while moving to get other better jobs somewhere else, those who move. That's the way that problem really ought to be understood. Managing low productivity workers, structurally low productivity workers with inadequate capital better is no solution at all. So I don't think the Prime Minister has given this thought. And you know, Shenell, this reflects the fundamental problem. There is no mechanism in the country for all of us to engage in a conversation about what the issues are. So he will bring his limited understanding to the problem, and all the rest of us who might have a better understanding have no forum, no national parliamentary forum in which we could locate the information, place the information there for the representatives of the people to consider. Rowley needs to think about that.
Interesting point you raised there. However, one of the things that stood out to me in his presentation during that meeting, he began to talk about the Teaching Service Commission and the fact that we're often waiting 4 years for an appointment of a teacher, or just a disciplinary matters taking about 9 years to move forward. Even with the establishment of a tribunal, as you said, if the resources are not there and we only appointing friends and supporters, would that system really change?
Well, the fundamental question is, what is the mechanism of oversight that the country has? When all is said and done, what is needed is parliamentary oversight. We elect our reps. We really need 2 jobs to be done by the elected reps. One job is to do what Rowley is doing, which is to run the executive and manage the executive function of the parliament. But the other job, for which the Constitution makes no provisions really, is the job of overseeing the execution of that executive function. Now that goes to the service commissions as well as the cabinet, the Judicial Service Commission, Teaching Service Commission, and so on. And when they do their work, they, at best, report to the Prime Minister and the President and what have you. You need an arrangement in the Parliament for them to be held to account by the non-executive reps in the Parliament.
But then the question lies, what administration that would come into power do you think would be willing to relegate some of those powers to an oversight body to really help keep them in check? Because even with the Prime Minister's statement as well, he called the current Service Commission a so-called independent commission, and there are a number of persons who would have come out before and said the Prime Minister opposes to anything independent, right? So even outside of this current PNM administration at the central government, the opposition or any party that would come into power, how willing would they be, and who is going to really push for that oversight? It has to be the civil society. It has to be the people.
All of us,
and what level of answering would we get outside of the election unless a demand is made during that election period for that constitutional reform that would create that level of oversight? but really and truly, is it in the benefit of any political administration?
But let's break that comment up into two parts. One part having to do with the independence of the commissions of the Prime Minister, independent of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. The way the Constitution is written, they're not appointed independent of the Prime Minister. He has a clear role. And when they do the jobs of quality control, for example, with respect to trying to move senior officers around, the Prime Minister has a veto in the Constitution. So there is a sense in which we have to be careful when we use the word independent. But maybe he's being cynical when he calls them so-called independent because he knows of those provisions, first of all. But secondly, effective oversight is what we have been fighting for since CLR James, to say nothing of since the 1970 revolution, February Revolution. We know that the country isn't working well because there is nobody to oversee the Prime Minister. And we need to change that. Now, that you're not going to get in any other way than the way we tried to get it in 1970. It has to be a national campaign undertaken by young people, by the media, by everybody in the society that pressures the politicians to come to grips with the fact that the citizens want control of the executive function in the country. Now, this is not independent oversight outside of the parliament. This is oversight inside the parliament. In other words, you have to change the constitution, change the structure of the parliament, make the cabinet a tiny minority of the whole parliament so that the rest of the parliament could tell the cabinet what to do. This is what you see in Britain. This is what you see fundamentally in the US, in the whole of Europe, and so on, in France, if you look carefully. Who will want to get it? Well, we are the people, and we are the owners of the society, and we're the ones who ought to be saying to one another and to the politicians, we're not satisfied with how this system is working. It is time to make fundamental change. Remember, that's the same problem we have here in Tobago with an executive council that nobody could supervise.
And we know that's something that you have been clamoring for even from the beginning, even during
From I was a little boy.
Even during the election period, that was a strong statement that you made. So there can be no saying that you have changed your tune. You have been consistent with that request. But so far, how has that conversation gone for you? How far, especially here at the level of the THA, how far has that conversation gone, especially in your interaction with the civil society and members of the public? How is that conversation going?
Well, let me say two things. First of all, here in Tobago, in Trinidad, and all around the Caribbean, I have never met anyone who, once they understand what you're talking about, would say that is not acceptable. Just like we found out in 1970. Right now in Jamaica, for example, there is a whole debate about how to reform the Constitution. And my colleagues consult with me all the time about it. And nobody there says we don't want this structural change. People in the Caribbean, given our history, want to have a say in how the government is run. And that's what I find in civil society in Tobago. That's what I find in the business community. People want to be involved. And in fact, Shenell, that's why there is such a clamor for people, by people, when they can't call the chief secretary, they can't get Fali, they can't get him on the phone. That's why there's such a worry and a concern about that, you see. So the society wants it. What we have never known, because we've only lived in an authoritarian system, is how that works. And it's the work of the scholars to clarify for the society how it should work. What is the design that will develop it? That's what researchers like myself and others should be bringing to the public. We didn't find the answer in 1970, though we wanted it. Now we are much better informed. We know exactly how the design, what should be the design of the THA and what should be the design of the Parliament in Trinidad and Tobago, first to get it. And we ought to go back to the business of clamoring for it. It is not Rowley's responsibility. It is your responsibility and mine as citizens. And one of these days, somewhere going down the road, we're going to have to get there if we want to make progress. The low productivity that Raul is talking about is fundamentally tied to the absence of these designs. In my research as an economist, I can demonstrate to you, as I demonstrate for the international community, that unless you get this institutional arrangement, the rule of law, so you could make policy subject to the rule of law and you could set up the business environment subject to the rule of law, you can't do the other restructuring things we need to do to grow productivity, and you can't set up the innovation function we need to grow productivity. So Raul may want productivity to grow, but if he doesn't want the institutional changes we need, he can't get the productivity to grow.
Right, and Dr. James, tell us about some of the societies where this current formula that you're proposing has successfully worked to transform, especially the productivity of the public sector.
If you look carefully at Britain, you see what we used to call the Westminster system. That's exactly what the Westminster system is. The cabinet is about 30 people. The parliament is 650. So the rest of the parliament could outvote and outnumber and outvote the cabinet. And therefore, as you saw last year, they're able to move the prime minister, evaluate his performance or her performance, and when the cabinet underperforms, when the prime minister is held to account, and in Britain last year you saw they moved two of them. And who did the moving? Primarily it was the Conservative Party. The majority of the Conservative Party members in the parliament are not in the cabinet. The majority of the PNM members, if not all of them, in Trinidad and Tobago, is in the cabinet. And all the members of the independents in the Tobago Assembly are in the Executive Council aligned to it as assistant secretaries. That is the opposite of what you find in Westminster. You look in France, you look in the US, you look in Finland, that's the design you see. And in those societies, public service is high productivity service. In those societies, service is innovative because when you have the backing of all of the players and everybody could come and bring their suggestions, that's the way you get service productivity to be high. Service innovation is very hard to do. But if you have a framework in which all of us could contribute our research and our thoughts, then service productivity could be raised by service innovation.
Excellent.
So that's what you see in the global community. Why can't we do it here, Shenell?
Well, there has to be the willingness of all leaders to accept or...
And all of us have to battle for it, right?
Well, exactly. All right, Dr. James, well, as we continue the conversation, we're going to get more into what's happening here in Tobago, especially with what's happening at Studley Park. So we're going to take a quick break, and right after that, we'll be back with more conversation. Guys, see you soon.
Yeah. Hey. Tobago updates.
Good morning and welcome back to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates. Guys, if you're just joining us, well, I tell you, you really have to go back and look at the beginning of this conversation because we've been having some extremely interesting talks, especially about the comments that the Prime Minister has made on Monday in regards to the Service Commission. But there's so much more for us to discuss, so short time, but we're going to try our best to see what we can do with it this morning because I have the pleasure of sitting with Dr. Vanus James. And one of the topics that are really hot on the agenda this morning is the appointment of the former minority leader, Ashworth Jack, as the new chairman of the board for the Studley Park Enterprise Limited. Now, there's a lot that can be said about that, but we're going to allow you to give your comments on these developments.
Well, you know, the reason I make my case about oversight is because elsewhere in the world, just continuing that conversation we were having about high performance, what is done in the US, in Britain, and so on, is that when you're making these senior appointments, high-level appointments, those persons must be carefully scrutinized by the oversight authority. In the case of the US, for example, he would have had to be scrutinized by the Senate, right? As a part of the oversight process. And when the Senate say, okay, he passed, that's when you appoint. Here in Tobago, we get away with the idea that the chief secretary and the secretaries can just use the structures to appoint who they want. No scrutiny. No scrutiny for technical capacity, no scrutiny for political record, past, the integrity issues, no scrutiny. So I am not satisfied with that way of running Tobago people's business. I'm not interested in who the individual is. I'm interested in the process. We need a proper process to be put in place for all senior appointments to be properly scrutinized by the representatives of the people in their oversight capacity. That means we need to reform the THA. Just the way you see Rowley going on with Trinidad, and they didn't want to change those rules. Same way, those who are autocrats in Tobago may be quite happy to run their autocracy. But it is not going to work for the people of Tobago, because 9 times out of 10, or maybe 95 out of 100, you will find you're making mistakes. You're going to be putting people who are not qualified to do the people's business, and you simply waste another round of time. We've been going on with this incompetence for some near 43 years since we've set up the THA. It's not going to work for us. It will not help us to develop Tobago. It won't help us to develop the companies, and we need to change it as a matter of urgency.
Are you aware of qualifications of Mr. Jack, especially in the area of quarries?
The public should be aware. I am not aware. The public should know. It is not the board's business. It is the people of Tobago's business. So we need a process to be put in place where we could say, bring your resume, let me, in my capacity as oversight, evaluate it and tell the people of Tobago, I am satisfied that this person is qualified. And it doesn't matter for Ashworth. Every board chairperson, every board member, for that matter, should be properly scrutinized by the representatives of the people of Tobago.
Right. And simply the public should be able to also make their own assessment of...
Well, if you set up the system I'm talking about,
yes,
the public will be able to go to the hearings on the appointment. You appoint Ashworth, okay, it's a suggested appointment. I get to go and say, this is what I know about Ashworth. I know him to be a competent man. His neighbor in Mason Hall will be able to go and check and say, well, this is what I know. I don't like this fella. You see, it can happen. It should happen. It is the best way to ensure quality control. And that's the direction in which all those service commissions issues should be resolved. So we in Tobago are shooting ourselves in the foot, continuing to utilize the structures that we have, serving the people of Tobago, underserving the people of Tobago, and failing to put ourselves on a path to development. Until we change the structure of the THA and allow for effective oversight that brings everybody into the governance process, we're wasting time.
correct. But this is the structure that we now have, and this is the structure that the current administration is working with, and this is the structure that was utilized to hire Mr. Jack, and we're just hoping that we could see an improvement in the functioning of that Studley Park enterprise, because you see it hasn't been operational for some time now.
But Shenell, we promised the people of Tobago in the last election, we will change the structure. So it's not enough for this government to keep going on with it. 16 months into it, not a word. This is not acceptable for the people of Tobago, in my view. And it's going to prove to be a downfall when it comes to matters like budget allocations and all of the other things.
Right. Well, interesting that you mentioned that, and this is a great segue into the conversation regarding the entire political landscape here on the island as we speak and how it's developing. You mentioned 16 months in, and we still haven't seen those structural reformations that were promised. You have given your grade at the end of the first term in office.
And I downgrade since then.
Very interesting. But in regards to not only following the mandate, because a lot of people have asked, is the mandate now the same, seeing that, the political vehicle is shifting? I wouldn't say that it has shifted as yet because we still haven't seen the concreteness of a political party, but as the political vehicle shifts, a lot of people have questioned the vision, the mandate. Is it the same? Can we still hold them in account of a number of things that were said on the political platform? How are you feeling about what was mandated to them during that time and what we should expect or what we should hold them to now that the vehicle is shifting?
Fundamentally, when you watch the election, you will see one thing. The people of Tobago were not happy to govern the way the PNM was governing. And so they wanted to change that. That was the fundamental mandate. Change the way the PNM run in Tobago. Eliminate the vindictiveness, the autocratic behavior. Let's change the structure of the THA and so on. That was the mandate, substantively. Let's change the way the THA works. Change its power to make law. Let's go for the autonomy to ensure that there will be lawmaking power inside the THA. And to have lawmaking power inside the THA, you have to set up the oversight arrangements, because the fundamental reason you need lawmaking power is to make rules to control what the Executive Council is doing. Now, in that context, people are not happy that 16 months into the process, the biggest challenge we have is we can't find our chief secretary.
And that could also be attributed to his workload.
What workload? That has to do
as the Secretary for Finance.
That doesn't have to do with workload. That has to do with the fact that you have maintained a system that could only work if everybody called it. That's the problem. People need the contacts in order to get things done. But if we set up the system properly, you don't need Farley's number. I wouldn't, even if, say, for example, he kept the promise to the people at Tobago that I would help them to do the development plan. Even if that promise was kept, I would need his number, because he would set up a system through which everybody could engage with one another and go on with the work. My point is that's the fundamental promise that was made, and that's why people moved the PNM and put this new outfit in power. And so the evaluation of 0 out of 10, a failing grade, comes from the fact that after 16 months, you've done nothing to change the governance arrangements from PNM-style government to a new style.
Dr. James, there's also the flip side of that we can look at, or try our best to see it from a different perspective, in the limited resources that has been given to this current administration. Limited time to try to really change something that has been instituted for so long. So there may be the argument that within this first term of office, they are trying to please, the constituents, or they are trying to make do with the limited funding that is being given and do some of the projects that may be most impactful. And something like this just may not be on the top of the priority lists where impact for our next election is concerned.
Well, that might suit you if you are able to draw your pay every month in a purgatory. But the people of the Tobago didn't elect you to run a purgatory. The decision was, we don't want the government to run the way the PNM was running it. So day one, you don't need 4 years to make this change. From day one, you take steps, not just to take up your office and go and earn your pay, but you take steps to empower the people of Tobago. That was the fundamental promise, don't forget. Empower the people, get the people involved. You could do a lot of things without changing the law, but the most basic thing is change the law. Let's fight for the autonomy. Let's fight for the opportunity to make law. Let's go out there and fight to change the boundaries. Take a look at one critical fact that is outstanding. Remember that big billboard that the PDP put up just on the main road there, saying
about
that
the value of
the oil and gas and so on. The 6-mile limit around Tobago don't entitle us to any say in that gas. I am today chairing a Shell committee to oversee a study to find out how proceeds from those gas and so on would be used to benefit fisherfolk in Tobago. But that's because of the gratuitous behavior of Shell. That has nothing to do with the THA pushing for the rights of the people of Tobago. We put them there to change the boundaries and fight for the people of Tobago in a proper way. 16 months into the term, not a word to the people of Tobago about those boundaries.
All right, and before we go, because we have to wrap up, because we don't have the time to continue such a conversation. I really wish that we were given the entire show this morning. But before you go, that conversation about Tobago's autonomy, we haven't been hearing it as much as we should. Tell us, what are your opinions on how far we've come in regards to making strides towards attaining that? Because we see a big stall happening at the parliamentary level, but at the level of the THA, and what should we be doing at this time?
Nothing has been done. 16 months. What should we do? Tomorrow morning, the Chief Secretary and his henchmen and women ought to call the people of Tobago together to engage in a conversation about what we're going to do, what we're going to say to the Prime Minister in Trinidad and Tobago about the reform of the THA. That's one part of the act in the bill in the Parliament, and what we're going to do about our boundaries, what we're going to do about lawmaking power. That should start immediately. We've wasted 16 months, no time to lose. That should be done right away. Tomorrow morning, that meeting should be called for everybody to come and talk about where we go from here. Until they do that, they will keep losing the confidence of the people of Tobago. And in the next election, I predict they will be put out of office.
All right, that's a lot. That's a lot that you have given us there. All right, Dr. James, thank you so much for giving us your time and always choosing us and just giving the knowledge to Tobagonians. We truly appreciate it. And guys, we're just going to take a quick break and we'll be back with loads more. See you after this.
Thank you, Shenell.
To a brand new dawning as the passion start around.